Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to New Books in Latin American Studies, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Ethan Besser-Frederick, a host of the channel, and today we'll be talking to Professor Bonar Hernandez Sandoval about his new book, Guatemala's Catholic Revolution, A History of Religious and Social Reform, 1920 to 1968. Professor Hernandez, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about my book and talk about the history of Catholicism in Guatemala.
I feel like your book is a list of keywords of terms that I love to talk about and read about, so it was a very easy choice for me to select your book. I'm excited to talk about it.
Well, thank you. I'm also very excited about it, to talk about it.
Before we get into your book, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write the book?
Yeah, so my name is, as you mentioned, my name is Bonar Hernandez Sandoval. I was born in Guatemala, and I came to the United States relatively young, and decided during the course of my college education to become a historian. Is something that I discovered about historical research that really interested me, especially because I wanted to find many years ago. I wanted to find the reasons why so many people from Central America had come to the United States, and so that eventually led me into the path to graduate school. And I went to the University of Texas, where I got my PhD in Latin American history. Since getting my degree, I've been working, actually before, during my graduate school education, I've been working on the history of Catholicism in Guatemala. And the main sort of question that has interested me, or one of the main questions that has interested for many years, has been sort of why is it that individuals decide to um, to enter the political sphere, and how religion informs their political activism or their social activism. Uh, that question eventually led me into this project. Began this project as this book began as a PhD dissertation a number of years ago, and the book, or the dissertation. So let me talk a little bit about how, just briefly, how the dissertation came out and how the book also was eventually published. Um, uh, Originally, I wanted to write a history about a general history about the Catholic Church during the 20th century in Guatemala. And I was mostly interested in writing a history about the institution. So I was originally, I wanted to use mostly sort of what we might call institutional sources, so sources that are produced by the Catholic Church. And but when I started to do the research for the book, I discovered that the main archive of the Catholic Church in Guatemala was going a process of renovation and reorganization. So it was unfortunately closed to all researchers. So I had to find sources. So I scrambled for a few weeks and tried to look for different sources, and that eventually led me to sort of an uncharted path in terms of historical research for the history of Catholicism in Guatemala. Eventually discovered that there were newly available sources at the Vatican archive, that related to Guatemala and the relationship between the Vatican and the Guatemalan Catholic Church and the Guatemalan state. Eventually, I also discovered, through a process of interviews that I did for the dissertation, that there were um, local sources that were particular to the church, and these sources were mostly in a number of parishes that are located in the western part of the country. And so the book kind of emerged as this, or it began as this attempt to write an institutional history of the church during the 20th century, but eventually the book, or the dissertation, and eventually the book turned to be sort of more of a sort of a history of the church, partly sort of a history from above, what we might call a history of the institution, but also a history from below. So I became interested in the process of finding new sources in trying to see how sort of local parishioners, and in this case, indigenous Maya Catholics, how they also participated into the different projects of reform of the church. And when I started to do additional research for the book, I continued along these same lines, and so I continued to kind of do research that was particular to sort of the institution per se, so more institutional sources, but also sort of more bottom-up sources that were kind of related to sort of how Catholicism evolved at the local level.
What a wonderful example of how archives build our histories for us sometimes, or reconstruct them, I guess, in your case, with the redevelopment going on.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things that this is something that I think is important for all of us who do research on topics and countries that whose archival institutions sometimes tend to be a little bit complicated in terms of access to sources, and some sources are not organized. The historian has to be very creative and be flexible and be willing to change the questions that the historian is asking. And so this project, over the years when I was working on it, taught me those issues.
So you put together this very local and very transnational history, which I found very interesting. And to start with your introduction, you make a very compelling argument that the Guatemalan Catholic Church, or at least the sort of missionary activities that I think many Latin American at least are familiar with, of viewing the church as a agent of social change, or at least of activism and progressive reform in the country during that time period, that change actually predates Vatican II and goes much earlier in the 20th century, which you date. So could you briefly introduce us to this thesis and this timeline that you would like to update with Guatemala's Catholic Revolution?
Yes. Yeah, so when I was talking about sort of the reason why this topic interested me, I was originally intrigued by the fact that the Catholic Church, in the case of Guatemala, but we can also talk about other countries in Latin America. Of course, there are differences in each country, but the Catholic Church in Guatemala, at least at the institutional level, was a very conservative institution. It was the leaders of the Catholic Church in the early part of the 20th century, and actually um, um, in the second part of the 20th century at the institutional level. They put forward a very conservative, politically speaking, anti-communist kind of discourse, and that became very clear in 1954 when the U.S. government sort of organized a military coup against the president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz. The Catholic Church was one of the key actors in the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz. The Catholic Church, the Catholic leaders supported the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in 1954, and so you have an institution that was, politically speaking, put forward an anti-communist discourse, was very conservative. Like the Catholic leader at the time, Moreno Rosell Arellano, was very much against sort of any types of kind of social reform, which he equated with communism. But then by the 1960s and 1970s, and this is a different time period from what I cover in the book, but 1960s, 1970s, at least at the local level, but also at the institutional level, you see this change to what we call progressive Catholicism. So I was interested in trying to kind of understand why that shift happened. And over the course of doing the research for the book, and especially when looking at what happens in the western part of the country, where you have a number of foreign missionaries who establish mission territories in the middle of the 20th century, when I started to study what happened in these mission territories, I discovered that many of the projects, but also the language that we tend to associate with progressive Catholicism and eventually liberation theology, which becomes sort of a central aspect of the Catholic Church in Guatemala, but elsewhere in Latin America. Sort of this more kind of socially engaged and politically active kind of sort of stance that many Catholics take, liberation theology. Um, when I started looking at this kind of how these kind of mission territories evolve and sort of the dynamics of sort of Catholicism and how individuals, especially Maya indigenous peoples, interacted with the institution, with the Catholic Church, I discovered that there were these projects and language that was evolving in the 1950s and even before Vatican II in the 1960s. And so that what we see with Vatican II is that sort of the one of the sort of crucial aspects of this project that I think is very important is that Vatican II, of course, is very important, and what happens in 1968 with the meeting of the Latin American bishops in Medellin, Colombia, is also very important. It has very important consequences for all of Latin America, but Vatican II serves to reinforce some of the sort of projects and the language that is already happening on the ground. There is already this kind of a social project, if you will, happening in the countryside in Guatemala, in the western part of the country in the 1950s and 1960s. So, with this argument, what I hope to contribute to the to the historical to historical research on the topic is that I want to to uh, to kind of encourage us to kind of think about how even though the Catholic Church is this transnational kind of international kind of global institution, and how it is undeniable that global developments affect the Catholic Church in Guatemala and elsewhere in Latin America, but it is important to kind of to look at what is happening sort of on the ground, if you will, and how there is this constant dialogue between what happens on the ground and what happens globally. So that's sort of one I think important aspect of this book.
Well, I very much loved the combination of very hyper-local history that you do at the village level of relationships within communities, while also simultaneously keeping that large global transformation in mind that you describe. I think that the book does that expertly, and anybody who's interested in that sort of history of Catholicism, or really of any country in Latin America, would really benefit from reading this.
Yes, yes, and thank you for saying that. And I should say here that it's also kind of the this book, and the dissertation also, and the book eventually, um, it is a product of of sort of the fact that archives and sources, different sources, are now available. For example, at the Vatican archives, um, those sources that I use in the early part of the book that I think we are going to be discussing kind of the first part of the book, but those sources became available just as I was starting to write or to do research on the dissertation, and so a project of this nature was possible, in part because I had access to the sources that I eventually used.
And I think that that's a great illustration of these transnational and local histories being already there. We, as historians, just have to have our eyes open to them and being willing to look in these sometimes smaller archives that are a little bit less convenient. Although certainly you had to out of necessity as well.
Exactly, exactly.
Now, the book itself, once past the introduction, is split into 3 parts, each part containing 2 chapters. Your first part, named Foundations, begins with your very first chapter, Papal Power and Church-State Relations. And this begins the book with the very nadir, or at least it seems like a low point of church-state relations in the early 20th century. So could you briefly explain a little bit how the church in Guatemala had gotten to such a low point in its influence and relationship with the state? And then what begins to change in the 1920s that serves this as a good bookend for the beginning of the book?
Yeah, so the Catholic Church in Guatemala, um, going back to the colonial period, as in other parts of Latin America, had a very significant influence over sort of political and social matters. It was definitely one of the, if not the most important institution in the lives of most Guatemalans, especially in the countryside, but also in the urban areas. Then independence happens, and there is this sort of very sort of mm, political, but also open sort of conflict between the conservatives and the liberals. So these two groups, political groups that emerged after independence, liberals and conservatives, and sort of the conflict sort of tends to color and influence most of political life in Guatemala during the 19th century. Liberals, Guatemalan liberals, want to um, subordinate the Catholic Church to the power of the state. Conservatives want to um, they want to retain, at least in a modified way, the influence, the social and political influence of the Catholic Church, which they see as a source of harmony and stability for the new nation in the 19th century. And then, so this conflict tends to kind of influence political life very significantly in the 19th century. In the 1870s, liberals, Guatemalan liberals, finally are able to hold on to power, and they are going to control the state until the middle of the 20th century. In the 1870s, Guatemalan liberals began to undo the social and political power of the Catholic Church. They do so through a series of reforms, anti-clerical reforms, which means that Guatemalan liberals, for example, they send the leader of the Catholic Church into exile in the 1870s. This is going to happen with other Catholic leaders in the years that follow. That these Catholic leaders, some of them are going to find themselves in exile for a number of years. They also, Guatemalan liberals also um, um, force foreign priests to leave the country. Um, a number of seminaries or a number of convents, that is, convents are closed. And this is very important, the properties of the Catholic Church are expropriated. The state takes over those properties. And that means that the Catholic Church is left without its economic clout. And it is also left without um, the priest that it needs to be a social force throughout the country. So by the beginning of the 20th century, there is an institution which I describe in the first chapter of the book, an institution that is a very weak institution. There are very few priests in the country, especially in the countryside. In the countryside, there are parishes that remain without a priest for years, and then parishioners, they see a priest only when there is a festival, a local festival, and or when there is a very special occasion. And the church also doesn't have sort of the economic resources to be a social force. It doesn't have the wealth that it had during the colonial period, in the early part of the independence period. So this church is the church that I found when doing when reading the sources for the early part of the 20th century. This is the source that I encountered in the early part of the 20th century. This is the church that Vatican officials, who are going to become very prominent in Guatemalan affairs in the 1920s and 1930s and thereafter, this is the church that they encounter. It is a weak institution. And Catholic leaders at the time, they are very much aware of that. Guatemalan Catholic leaders, they are very much aware of that. And so, as a consequence of that, what we see in the 1920s, beginning in the 1920s, but this becomes really evident in the 1930s and 1940s, is that Catholic leaders, Guatemalan Catholic leaders, together with representatives from the Vatican, they began to implement a series of reforms that are intended to take the church out of this kind of weak position. And one important piece of that project is to bring in foreign missionaries. The political context in Guatemala changes by the 1930s. Guatemalan liberals become less interested in um, diminishing the power of the Catholic Church, because after all, the power of the Catholic Church had been virtually destroyed in the late 19th century. But Guatemalan liberals um, are also are in the 1920s and 1930s are more interested in getting the support of the Catholic Church politically. And so there is this agreement, this is an unwritten agreement between Catholic leaders and Vatican officials on the one hand, and Guatemalan liberals on the other hand. They agree that liberals agree that they will allow the Catholic Church and Vatican officials to bring in foreign missionaries into the country, and in change for that, Catholic leaders and Vatican officials, they tend to be supportive of the Guatemalan government, which is controlled by liberals. So this unwritten agreement allows the Catholic Church in Guatemala. So when I talk about the Catholic Church in Guatemala in this period, I'm talking about Guatemalan priests, Guatemalan Catholic leaders, but also Vatican officials. This agreement allows the Catholic Church to begin a series of reforms, which include bringing foreign missionaries, but also allows the Catholic Church to revive the national seminary, which is where Catholic priests were trained, Guatemalan Catholic priests were trained, and then there are other reforms that are going to become important in the middle of the 20th century. For example, the creation of a number of lay Catholic institutions that are going to become very prominent in the Guatemalan countryside. But what happens in Guatemala in the 1920s, 1930s is a very important story about how there is this shift when it comes to church-state relations. There is a shift that allows the Catholic Church to begin to implement a series of reforms that allow it to get out of its weakened position. But there is also a story of how the Vatican begins to gradually exert increasing influence over the life of the Catholic Church in Guatemala, and also it has a great deal of influence when it comes to relations between the Catholic Church, the Guatemalan Catholic Church, and the Guatemalan state. So there is a story of how the Catholic Church in Guatemala. It is evident that it is tied to this kind of more global developments that are happening elsewhere in the world. For example, the Vatican is very much politically involved in European politics at the time. That's a topic that I address a little bit in the book. But this is what happens in Guatemala. The Vatican is very much interested in getting the church to become a social and political force again.
I think that many of us are familiar with stories of the church losing many of its colonial powers and privileges, but you do such a great job of illustrating what that looked like on the ground. One of the examples that jumps out to me is when you cite one Vatican estimate that there were only 80 Catholic priests in a country of almost 2.5 million people. And it really illustrates how, on the ground level, the church had such little influence compared to what you later describe in the book, which is such a high level of engagement between priests and many people, especially in the highlands. So I think that this chapter does a great job of describing the lack of church social influence in people's everyday lives.
Exactly, and it also kind of speaks to there is another story here, that institutionally the Catholic Church is very weak, but that doesn't mean that a Catholic culture has ceased to exist. And in fact, what happens is that there is this increasing gulf or distance during this period between the institution and the practices, and the doctrine of the institution, and what Guatemalans, especially in the highlands, are doing, what indigenous peoples are doing, especially when they practice their Catholicism. There is a big difference, and this is going to become a crucial issue as the foreign missionaries begin to arrive in the western part of the country.
And yes, that certainly is a theme in the book that even if Catholicism doesn't just stop because there's no priest there, and in fact, Catholicism in the Highlands can look very different than it does in the rest of the country.
Exactly.
Your second chapter in this first part, the Romanized Church, further develops what you've already talked about here of the Vatican becoming more involved in the management of these national level churches to build up their social and economic powers. And I want to point to one argument you make in particular on page 42, that the Romanization of the Guatemalan Church took the form of two major strategies. First, inviting foreign priests into the country, and second, training a new cohort of domestic lay leaders. So could you tell us why these two strategies were chosen and how they played out in the country?
They are chosen um, by Catholic leaders at the time because eventually, kind of the initial in the 1920s and in 1930s as well, the one initial kind of emphasis or goal of Catholic leaders is to train Guatemalan priests. That's what, especially the leaders of the Catholic Church in Guatemala, um, that's what they want to do. And this is in part because there is a very nationalist kind of sentiment among the priests in Guatemala and sort of the leaders of the Catholic Church more generally. But then what happens is that there are very few priests in the 1930s, and the resources for the National Seminary are scarce. And so the Vatican begins to sort of what I discovered in the correspondence between Vatican officials, which is a very rich kind of set of documents that I found at the Vatican archives in Vatican City. So the correspondence between Vatican officials and Guatemalan leaders uh, tends to focus on the fact that, according to Vatican officials, the national seminary will not produce enough priests to staff the parishes in the countryside. And so the Vatican officials began to make the argument that it is important to bring in foreign missioners in order to eventually produce a new generation of Catholic priests, Guatemalan Catholic priests. And so this is a long-term project that Vatican officials foresee in the 1930s. The idea is that foreign missionaries will allow the church to recover its social and religious position in the countryside, and that eventually will lead young people to enter the national seminary. So that's one emphasis. But then there is also the objective by Vatican officials to allow the church to once again to recover its social position in the countryside. And so Vatican officials began to make the argument that it is necessary to bring foreign missionaries. But Vatican officials, and this is an argument that is shared by Guatemalan Catholic leaders at the time, especially the Archbishop of Guatemala at the time, Mariano Rosel Arellano, who begins his tenure in 1939, and he oversees a lot of these reforms. He dies in the early 1960s, so he's a very crucial figure. He's the main figure, Catholic figure, who supports the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. This U.S. overthrow the Guatemalan government in 1954. Uh, but so Rosel Arellano and Vatican officials agreed that it is also important to involve the Catholic laity into the institutional life of the church. So they believe that sort of a step, a very important step for kind of restoring the influence of Catholicism in Guatemala, especially in the countryside, is to integrate the Catholic laity into the life, into the structures, into the rhythms of the Catholic Church. So these two projects eventually become the centerpiece of the program of reform the Catholic leaders and Vatican officials are going to support in the 1930s and thereafter. And they become kind of the foundation in many ways of the Catholic Church that we see in the 1950s and 1960s and thereafter. Actually, sort of the influence of foreign missionaries continued to be very important in the 1960s, even in the 1970s. And Catholic, Guatemalan Catholics, the laity, definitely become a more central aspect of the church in the second part of the 20th century.
Now, one of the most enjoyable parts of this chapter for me was the resistance by some priests in Guatemala, especially Guatemalan priests, meaning that originally from the country, to this what you term Romanization, especially of the influence and perceived importance that foreign priests had in the country. So, could you tell us a little bit about Guatemalan priests sometimes not being on board with this with these reforms?
Yes, there is, as I briefly mentioned before, there is a story here of this kind of nationalist posture that many Catholic priests, Guatemalan Catholic priests, take. Um, there is definitely conflict. The Archbishop Mariano Rosell and many priests in Guatemala, they oppose the arrival of foreign missioners. And the reason that they oppose it is because um, many of these Catholic priests and even the Archbishop, they lose considerable influence over the life of the Catholic Church when foreign missionaries arrive, especially in here. I should mention that so the main group of foreign missionaries that I study in the book is the Catholic Foreign Mission Society of America, better known as Merinol. A Catholic priests in Guatemala, they lose considerable influence over the life of the church and over the direction of the church when Merinol and other foreign missionaries arrive. So, kind of at the heart of this conflict is the issue of power. That's one. So, kind of to put it bluntly, that's one of the main factors that is driving this kind of conflict between Guatemalan priests and sort of the foreign missionaries that arrive. And this conflict is going to linger for many years. For many years, and so that doesn't mean that all Guatemalan priests oppose the arrival of foreign missionaries and the influence of the Vatican, because there are going to be moments of cooperation and collaboration between Catholic priests and foreign missionaries down the road. But in 1930s and 1940s, Rosell Arellano, in the documents I discovered that he's opposed to the arrival of foreign missionaries, but he recognizes at the same time, he's in many ways, Rosell Arellano and other Guatemalan priests, they are kind of caught in this kind of very difficult position, to put it that way, because they recognize that they don't have priests. Rosell Arellano, in one of his pastoral letters, he complains that he has no priests. He says, I have no priest, and so he recognizes this, and so he decides to go along with this project of inviting foreign missionaries, especially Merinol from the United States.
And that sets us well for the next part of the book, where the church gets to bear a lot of the fruit of this work and in this investment. So in part 2, Expansion, you begin with the very vigorously named chapter, Resurgent Church. So how was the church resurgent during this time period? So now setting into the late 1930s and the beginning of the 1940s. And how was it able to, or what did it use that influence on? How did it exert its influence when it had started to gain it? At this time now, I think also contemporary with the Ubico dictatorship.
Yes, yes. And so the church, the resurgent church of the 1930s, 1940s, it is or early 1940s, it is a church that becomes a more public institution. It becomes a more public institution because in this chapter I focus on mostly on the early tenure of Rosel Arellano. Um, and so the church becomes a more public institution because Rosel Arellano begins to orchestrate a number of public events, religious congresses, processions, um, and all of a sudden in the 1930s and early 1940s, you see the streets of Guatemala City and the streets of other urban centers, and even in the countryside, you see the streets filled with Catholics, religious events. Once again, are in the public. That's one of the things that Guatemalan liberals had prohibited in the late 19th century, and so the church had become retrenched to the inside of the church buildings. But now in the 1930s and early 1940s and thereafter, Rosel Arellano, supported by Vatican officials, they began to kind of sort of organize these kind of more public events. And so you see this resurgent church in the sense, it is a resurgent church in the sense that once again, you see the church in the streets, Guatemalan Catholics in the streets of Guatemala. Kind of Catholicism becomes a public force, or begins to become a public force once again. And now, Rosel Arellano is a very interesting, a very important figure, as I said before, because he, along with Vatican officials, they recognize that there is a political opening during the Ubico dictatorship. Ubico, so he's a Guatemalan liberal. The liberals in the 19th century, they tend to espouse this kind of set of political ideals, including political freedom, um, sort of ideals that are consistent with 19th century liberalism. But by the early years of the 20th century, many Guatemalan liberals, they become dictators, and this is the case of Jorge Ubico. So Ubico, in order to maintain his dictatorship, he recognizes the need to reach an agreement with the Catholic Church. That's the agreement that I was talking about before. Ubico wants the support of the Catholic Church. Ubico also wants the Catholic Church to remain an institution that doesn't get involved in politics. And so Catholic leaders, including Rosel Arellano and Vatican officials, the papal nuncio at the time in the 1930s, they decide to go along with what Ubico wants. And so Rosel Arellano recognizes that there is this political opening. Vatican officials recognize that Ubico is willing to reach an agreement with the Catholic Church. So Ubico, in exchange for the Catholic Church not becoming involved in politics and supporting his government, allows Rosel Arellano to orchestrate these public events. And so you see, beginning in 1930s and late 1930s and early 1940s, you see kind of Catholicism becoming this kind of public force once again. At the same time, Ubico decides to allow the Catholic leaders to invite foreign missionaries, and so this is when a number of foreign missionaries began to arrive in Guatemala in the 1930s, but also especially in the early 1940s. So Merinol begins to arrive in increasingly large numbers in the 1940s, but they began to arrive in the early 1940s. That's when the first missionaries began to arrive. And so in the countryside, you see not a lot yet, but you see more priests in the countryside. So this is the resurgent church that I'm describing in that chapter. It is a church whose pastors, in this case foreign missionaries, are now more visible in the countryside, and you have this series of public events, public congresses, and religious processions that Guatemalans hadn't seen in many years.
Your fourth chapter, turning to the countryside, the missionary church, moves us back to the very local level of parish interactions and community dynamics with these priests, with this newfound social influence that the church is trying to exert. And argue here, and I'll quote, that the rise of a missionary church in Huehuetenango exacerbated community divisions and brought to the fore a largely unexplored religious story of priest-parishioner engagement. So could you tell us how this renewed Catholic activism and missionary work, how did that play out on the community level?
Yes, and so here in this chapter, what I was hoping to uncover when I started working on this project, I was hoping to uncover sort of the more traditional history of conflict between Catholic priests and indigenous Maya peoples that tends to predominate in in a lot of the literature on the topic for the study of Guatemalan Catholicism. There is a lot of writing that was done by anthropologists who did field work in Guatemala during this period in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, and most of their accounts when working in the Western Highlands among the various Maya communities in the western part of the country, most of their accounts point to a history of conflict between Catholic priests and indigenous Maya peoples. And so when I started looking at reading the documents, I was hoping to kind of to uncover a little bit more of more of that history of conflict between the institutional church and indigenous peoples. But then when I started looking at the documents, and for this chapter, I realized a great deal on missionary accounts. These are missionary accounts written by the members of Merinol. What I began to uncover was, yes, that history of conflict that appeared in the ethnographic work that was done at the time. And certainly that history of conflict is cannot be overlooked. There is a very sharp conflict between indigenous peoples who resent the arrival of foreign missionaries who are interested in imposing sort of this more Romanized, sacrament-driven version of Catholicism on indigenous communities. So certainly that conflict exists, and the conflict becomes very serious. And I point in the chapter that it becomes political sometimes. So the conflict is very real. But then, kind of looking at these sources, especially kind of taking a longer kind of perspective, because the book covers a period of about 40 years. 40 or so years. When looking at this kind of taking a more kind of longer perspective of what is happening in Guatemala in 1940s and 1950s, especially in the Western Highlands and particularly in the Department of Huehuetenango, as you mentioned, is that this conflict, although it exists, it doesn't affect all the interactions between foreign missionaries, between Merinol and indigenous Maya communities. That is to say that there is something else that is happening. That is that there is a process of accommodation. Certainly, that process of accommodation between foreign missionaries and indigenous Maya peoples is shaped by a story of conflict. There are divisions and there are differences. But then what happens is that there is this process of accommodation whereby foreign missionaries begin to adapt. They have to adapt to the circumstances that they encounter in Huehuetenango. Huehuetenango is one of the, or at the time and still is one of the most remote aspects of the regions of the country. Historically speaking, it was a relatively isolated part of the country. Roads were almost non-existent in Huehuetenango and in large parts of the western part of the country. The terrain is very difficult, so there are lots of mountains. That's why it's called the Western Highlands. And so the foreign missionaries, Maryknoll had to adapt. They couldn't be present in all parishes at the same time. And when they traveled to different parishes, they had to find allies in those parishes. So the members of Maryknoll began to adapt to local circumstances. They began to eventually they began to allow certain members of certain communities to have a great deal or have increasing influence over the project of religious reform. And on the other hand, indigenous peoples, indigenous communities, they realized that they also had to adapt. And this was in large part because these missionaries, especially in Maryknoll, were bringing kind of resources into the communities. So, for example, Maryknoll they began to, in 1940s, in 1950s, they began to provide medicines to indigenous communities. And so they had to interact, that is to say that it was not that indigenous peoples in Maryknoll couldn't see each other. Actually, there is a lot of interaction, and that interaction is something that I was very interested in uncovering. And in the process of uncovering that interaction, I discovered that at the local level there was this process of accommodation that was almost inevitable because of the circumstances that Maryknoll encountered, and because indigenous Maya peoples, in some cases, in many cases, they wanted to have access to the resources that Maryknoll were bringing into their communities, including medicine, but other resources as well.
Now, there's a lot of striking anecdotes in this chapter, some really great interactions that you've captured here. And I think the one that strikes me is about the almost, I think I feel comfortable calling it a very colonial attitude that some of these Maryknollers bring with them to these villages. They think of themselves as a second conquistador, as a second wave of missionaries re-Christianizing the region. And they eventually have to compromise, like you said. And I think it culminates in one of my favorite ceremonies they do. Maybe this is in a later chapter, where they invite the indigenous communities to bring in ears of corn to perform ceremonies in the church there, so that way they can at least have it be somewhat in line with Catholic teaching, rather than being too, as they consider it, pagan.
Yes, yes. Maryknollers, as you mentioned, they arrive in Guatemala sort of very much thinking about what they perceive as kind of restoring kind of the glory of the Catholic Church. They talk about kind of the colonial period a great deal in the early documents, and that's something that they want to do. They also arrive with a politically speaking, with a very conservative mindset that leads them to support sort of an anti-communist discourse. And it is one of the most it was one of the most interesting aspects of the book, kind of trying to understand how and why these missionaries began to change their perspective once they encounter and they interact with indigenous Maya communities. Once they began to kind of work in the western part of the country. In a later chapter, I argued that eventually what happens is that Maryknoll, members of Maryknoll, they go a process of conversion themselves. They are trying to convert indigenous people to a Romanized, sacrament-driven version of Catholicism, and certainly that is going to happen a great deal. And um, but Maryknoll, the members of Maryknoll, they themselves change, and so the change that happens in Guatemala is not only among the Maya, indigenous Maya population and Guatemalans, who many Guatemalans who began to kind of practice the sacraments on a more kind of daily basis, and become more engaged with the institutions and the life of the church. But it is also a story of how foreign missionaries also began to change. And that change is going to, I should say, that it's also affected by the fact that there are different generations of Marinollers who arrive in Guatemala. So the early Marinollers, they tend to, as you described, to look at the colonial past with certain nostalgia. But then the younger Marinollers who arrive in the 1950s and 1960s, definitely this is the case, they tend to be more open-minded, if you will. They tend to be more willing to incorporate, as you were describing, certain aspects of Maya religion, certain aspects of costumbre, which is a term given to sort of the traditions and the practices of Maya community, the religious practices of Maya communities.
Now, this sets us up very well for the third and final part of the book, Transformations. And I can see that I pulled that corn story accidentally from your fifth chapter, the Reformist Church, the story of them doing a religious ceremony with ears of corn. So could you tell us a little bit in this chapter on the Reformist Church, why did missionaries and the church writ large, but especially these missionaries in the Highlands, start to push for more social and economic reforms during this time period, when we've mostly been talking about spiritual reforms to this point? And what did these reforms look like on the ground?
Yes, so to the question of why, it is both. It was both an issue of um, trying to be practical. Marinollers, I described in the previous chapter that they began to provide medicines to Maya communities, and that's how some members of Maya communities decide to support um, the religious project of reform supported by Marinol and Catholic leaders in Guatemala more broadly. But eventually, Marinollers also began to create a more kind of institutional kind of set of kind of social projects. So the provision of medicines eventually turns into clinics, into rural clinics, and then eventually Marinollers they began to they began to establish literacy programs. They also, it is very important, they also began to create agricultural and credit cooperatives in various parts of the Western Highlands, especially in Huehuetenango. Those projects, they tend to begin as kind of pragmatic kind of projects. Marinollers want to attract more indigenous peoples into the buildings, right? And so they provide these resources, they organize certain projects because they want more if you will, they want more Romanized Catholics, individuals who are practicing the sacraments um, in attending Mass on a consistent basis. Uh, and so this is how these projects begin. That's why they begin, actually. Uh, but then by the 1950s, what you also see is that more broadly, outside of the confines of the Catholicism in Guatemala, the Guatemalan state and the U.S. government they are supporting programs of development. Development kind of the term development becomes sort of the main, or one of the main aspects driving U.S. policy, or one of the main aspects driving U.S. policy toward countries like Guatemala. And the idea is that development, and this becomes even more crucial after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. The idea is that programs of development, such as cooperatives, uh, uh, health clinics, literacy programs, they will prevent countries like Guatemala to follow the example of Cuba and eventually become a communist country or a socialist country. And so outside of the church, there is a strong support for programs of development. Eventually, when the Alliance for Progress instituted by the U.S. government during the Kennedy administration, this becomes even more important. And so Marinollers and the Catholic Church is not immune to these developments. And so what I hope to uncover in that last part of the book is how Marinollers are acting on a kind of pragmatic basis. They are trying to attract more Catholics into the life of the church, but they are also what they are doing is consistent with what is happening more globally. At least when it comes to U.S. Latin American relations, that development becomes the one of the central aspects of U.S. policy. And it is important not to forget that U.S. Mary are coming from the United States, and so they are definitely shaped by these developments. Many of them admire um, John F. Kennedy. They tend to be very supportive of John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s. Now, when these projects are eventually instituted, what I discovered looking at the missionary reports produced by Merinol, but also by looking at some archival material that I found in various parishes in Guatemala, is that these projects take a life of their own. They become a central aspect of indigenous communities, and they become, in many cases, one of the major ways through which Mary knowledge interact with indigenous peoples and vice versa. And here there is I haven't mentioned this, but there is a very important institution that emerges that is going to be very important for these projects, these social projects, and the Reformist Church to emerge and evolve. And this institution is Catholic Action. Catholic Action had been created by Catholic leaders in Guatemala in the 1930s as a way to try to restore the religious influence of the Catholic Church. Catholic Action was a European institution that eventually made its way to Latin America. In Guatemala, the idea was as elsewhere, the idea was to incorporate Guatemalan Catholics into this institution, Catholic Action, and that Catholic Action will become a way for the church to restore its religious and even social influence. And so Merinoles, when they arrive in Huehuetenango, they begin to establish Catholic Action. That's the way that they try to create a Romanized church and impose a more sacrament-driven version of Catholicism in Huehuetenango. And so they begin to recruit a lot of young indigenous parishioners into the ranks of Catholic Action. Catholic Action becomes very important during the 1950s and 1960s because the leaders of Catholic Action, the members of Catholic Action, they are the ones who are not only teaching the catechism, they are the ones who are not only expanding this kind of Romanized version of Catholicism, but they are the ones who are in many ways in charge of organizing certain social projects such as health clinics, literacy programs, and crediting agriculture cooperatives. And so eventually what you see is that the life of many of these indigenous communities in Huehuetenango, it becomes intrinsically tied to social programs, and eventually these social programs take a life of their own. And eventually the language that emerges with these programs is a language that is not only meant to attract people into the church, but it's also a language that, as Meritores began to talk about in 1950s and even early 1960s, it's a language that leads them to say that it is important to have these social programs because it will help improve the life of indigenous peoples, and the members of Catholic Action are also making this argument that these social programs are important in order to improve the lives of indigenous peoples.
This all finally culminates in your sixth and final chapter, The Progressive Church, where you focus in on how the as you said, the way that these social projects take on a life of their own leads some, both of the clergy and these foreign missionaries, but then also obviously indigenous leaders and community members to begin to become what you've already termed progressive Catholics, or what you also say in this chapter you could maybe call revolutionary Catholics. So can you explain this development and its significance for later Guatemalan history?
Yes, so this chapter in many ways serves as the story that I tell, the chapter that it serves as a good indication of what is going to happen later in the 1970s in Guatemala. By the 1960s, the Reformist Church actually continues to expand. This Reformist Church that I described in the earlier chapter, in chapter 4 and chapter 5, it continues to evolve. So the emphasis becomes not only on religious reform, sort of expanding the Romanized Church, but the emphasis continues to be in the 1960s on sort of creating kind of the social conditions so that indigenous peoples will have an improved standard of life, which, according to Merinol, can be done by providing medicines, by teaching people how to write and read, and by uh, uh, getting people access to credit and new agricultural techniques such as fertilizers, which become kind of increasingly widely available in the Guatemalan countryside in the 1960s and thereafter. But the Reformist Church continues to grow in the 1960s when Vatican II is going to happen. Vatican II happens between the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II happens between 1962 and 1965. But so this Reformist Church continues to exist, and the push to expand a sacrament influence version of Catholicism continues to exist. But what happens in the 1960s, especially, it is already happening in the late 1950s, is, as I was mentioning before, is that Merinol began to talk about um, having, for example, crediting agricultural cooperatives, not just for the sake of attracting people into the church, but because they recognize that that these projects in themselves are important. And by the early 1960s, what you see is this younger generation of Merinol who arrive in Guatemala, who tend to be kind of very optimistic about the future, about the prospects of the future in the early 1960s. Um, but also many members of Catholic Action, indigenous peoples who become leaders of the Catholic Action movement in the western part of the country. These are kind of relatively young people, um, people in their 20s and 30s. Um, they tend to have a very optimistic version of kind of life in Guatemala, or vision of life in Guatemala. But many of these individuals, Merinol and members of Catholic Action, they began to talk about not only about having these kind of social programs, but also creating sort of the broader conditions um, for having a sort of a higher standard, a better standard of living in the countryside. So there is talk about kind of reforming the environment. The idea is that it is not enough to just give people medicines, but it is important to actually create a condition so that indigenous peoples can have a better standard of living. And so there is a story here in the early 1960s of how, at the local level, the members of the Catholic Church, including foreign missionaries and members of Catholic Action, how they are already talking about kind of social reform, not just for the sake of religious reform, but social reform as a very important aspect of uh, of the Catholic, or what the Catholic Church is doing in Guatemala. And here there is also a story in this chapter. I was hoping to uncover this after analyzing the documents, the missionary reports that I had access to. There is a story of how sort of Merinol and the members of Catholic Action go through a process of conversion themselves. Conversion that leads them to recognize that it is important to incorporate certain aspects of Maya religion into the version of Catholicism. So the emphasis becomes less and less on imposing and more and more on kind of listening and adapting and sort of incorporating certain aspects of Maya religion into the life of the local church. There is also a story here of how in the 1960s, what you see is the creation of a new class of Catholic leaders, not only at the institutional level, but among the members of Maya communities. And this is going to become a very important story for what comes next in Guatemala in the 1970s and 1980s, that many of these, many members of Catholic Action that are trained by Mary Knowles in the 1950s and 1960s, they are going to they are going to become very important in that period in 1950s and 1960s, but there are also many of them are going to become very important in the 1970s. And so perhaps one of the most important legacies of these programs of reform, religious and social reform that Mary Knowles and the Catholic Church more broadly supports, is that these programs they set a foundation for the creation of local leaders among Maya communities. And that's sort of the story that is going to become very important later on.
Certainly. I just finished teaching a class in which I Rigoberto was one of the assigned texts, and so it was very fun to go from that book to this book and immediately see the connections and how clearly your thesis is demonstrated by the end, that many of the features of Catholicism and progressive Catholicism and liberation theology that Guatemala is already known for begin very early. It's an excellent book. We have come to the end of the book itself, but we didn't get to talk about everything that's interesting in it. Like the professor has hinted here, the book also explores U.S. interest in the Cold War, the use of media and introduction of media, as well as developmentalist economic theory. There's a number of interesting points in this book. And thank you so much for sharing it with us. But before we go, Professor, could you tell us what you are working on now or what you'll be working in the future? What can we look forward to?
Sure. So at the moment, I am working on what we might call, or what I envision as kind of a second part to this project. So I'm working on a project that is specific to the 1970s and 1980s, during the most violent years of the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted from 1960s to 1996. But there is the 1970s, especially the late 1970s and early 1980s, are characterized by a great deal of violence, state-sponsored violence especially. So in this project, I'm basically essentially kind of tracing these networks of activism that emerged in the 1950s and 1960s among the members of Catholic Action and among other groups within the Catholic Church, and how those networks of activism evolved in the 1970s and 1980s. And so you mentioned the case of Rigoberta Menchú. And so Rigoberta Menchú and her father, Vicente Menchú, they come from Catholic Action. They are part of the Catholic Action movement in the 1960s. Her father is in 1970s, and Rigoberta Menchú eventually joins it later on. So I'm looking at how some of the